all of you in our plenary sessions, which is entitled What Transformation Are Crucial in Formulary Management in a Shifting Global Trade Landscape. And I would like to welcome all of you. And as you know that we are living in a truly unprecedented times where global trade, geopolitical, and healthcare are more interconnected than ever before. Today, as you know, we are facing a landscape where politically charged decisions, international trade dynamics, and economic pressures are directly shaping how medicines are priced, accessed, and ultimately how they can deliver care to our patients. These are no longer abstract policy discussions. They are real-world challenges that are impacting a clinical practice every single day. As formulary leaders, policymakers, and decision makers, and healthcare professionals, we are being challenged to rethink our traditional approach, adopt new models, and evolve the way we manage formularies and ensure sustainable access to medications. And before we begin this important discussion and timely discussion, I would like to take the moment and introduce our incredible multidisciplinary group of experts. We are truly fortunate to have a representative from different places, different workplaces, and different backgrounds. And we would like to welcome our esteemed panelists who are from formulary leaders from leading institutions across Saudi Arabia, NIPCO, National Insurance Perspective, and key voices from pharmaceutical industry, beside our great international market access expert, Neil. And let me invite our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves to our audience. So could you please start, Dr. Amar?
Assalamu alaikum. Abu Bakr Omar, I'm a consultant clinical pharmacist. I worked at different specialties and across multiple industries. I started at the King Saud Medical City and then shifted to the pharmaceutical industry. And then my ship landed at NIPCO, and I just left NIPCO last week. And I'm right now at the academia section.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wujdana Baras. I'm a senior cardiology clinical pharmacist and the drug policy and regulation director at Ministry of Health. My previous experience was at King Faisal Specialist Hospital. Then I moved to Ministry of Health for formulary management and policy and regulation setting.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nada Al-Aqil. I'm a consultant clinical pharmacist and currently working at CHI as a healthcare advisor with formulary management background.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Amal Najjar. I'm called the mother of all pharmacists. Here this is nothing to do with my age, by the way. Okay, I have a clinical background, drug information background, drug assessment background, and currently I'm working at HTA Center at Saudi Arabia.
My name is Mohammed Ahmed. I'm involved with formulary management in King Faisal Specialist Hospital. I'm also a clinical pharmacy specialist.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Salih Abu Hussein, Market Access Director in AstraZeneca. I worked in for multiple companies basically for over 13 years. I worked in sales, key account management, and also market access.
And for our international expert, Neil, brief introduction about yourself. You are muted.
Second.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon. I'm a consultant. I've been working in the area of global market access for over 25 years now. Particular interest in geopolitical trends, especially the last year, and it's a pleasure to join you.
So thank you all for this brief introduction. And as you can see, our audience, we have a unique, powerful mix of perspectives in this room. And bringing together procurement, policy, clinical leadership, industry, and strategic mindset to this discussion will add a lot of value to our understanding for geopolitical and future expectations when it comes to affordability and access to medications. This is exactly the kind of multidisciplinary dialogue that we need to navigate the complexities of today's global trade environment and its impact on formulary management. So if you allow me to go directly to HTA, since I have a great passion about HTA, and ask Dr. Amal. Dr. Amal, let's start with some of the new legislation significantly affecting the level of evidence submitted and available upon the new drug approvals. We see in recent commentary published in New England Journal of Medicine that FDA leadership now they established a new accelerated pathway by having a new era where approval of drugs will be based on a single pivotal trials. And this will be the new default regulatory pathways. From a formulary perspective, and as someone who has dedicated most of their life to evidence-based evaluations, how should health system adapt their evaluation frameworks when therapies enter the market with potentially less replicated evidence at the time of approval?
Well, all of us can understand this is a fundamental change on what we used to do, with the drug listing to the formulary. However, let's look at it in a positive way, saying we are moving from being a gatekeeper to the stewardship, understanding. And it's no more the process of enlisting the drug to the formulary under, like fire and go. Before, the drugs are listed in the formulary, and that's the end. No monitoring, no observation. Now it's like a shift from reproducing or reproduction to integration and monitoring and observation, and depending more rather than the clinical or many clinical trials. Now they are depending on real world evidence, on outcome-based agreements or contracting, on how to consider rigorous, even if it is single pivotal clinical trial, not to depend anymore on soft surrogate endpoint. We have to have like solid endpoints like mortality, hospitalization. We are changing the landscape from the traditional, work to this transformation, and we have to align with this. We have to change our mindset in order to be capable to, walk the way with all those countries, and to understand exactly how can we rely on generating new evidence, giving the medication like conditional listing to be listed in the formulary like for 1 year, and then revisit the evidence again and reassess and see whether we can keep this medicine in the formulary, or we have to do, certain agreement or certain arrangement.
Well, thank you, Dr. Amal, for this answer, and I totally agree with you that this will help patients get their medicine in a timely manner, since we are depending on pivotal trials, and then we can depend on real-world evidence to collect more data and effectiveness. And I'll move now to Dr. Mohammed. And as a regulatory agencies move toward accepting single pivotal trials and mechanism-based pathways for advanced therapies. And when we say advanced therapies, of course, we are referring to gene therapies, CAR-Ts, cell therapies. Do you anticipate a greater responsibility falling on payers and formulary committees and formulary managers to generate post-marketing evidence of effectiveness? And how should our institutional framework evolve to support this shift? And importantly, do we have the current capacities to do such task effectively?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And as was mentioned earlier, I think if this change is seen by other regulatory authorities, we will be, as payers and P&T committees, we will now be, instead of adopters of evidence, generators of evidence. Question about whether we're ready to do that or not will require each individual institution to undertake its own capacity assessment. I can tell you from sort of personal experience in King Faisal, when we try to implement outcome-based agreements with clinical components, that was a significant challenge because it required different stakeholders, many of whom were not clinical, to be involved with you. So if you scale that up to real-world data generation, as well as linking the generation of that evidence to formulary inclusion, I think it's going to require a significant assessment of our own capacity on individual institutions. And individual institutions in the kingdom, because we are by itself we all have our own individual P&T committees that act like their own HTAs and so on. So each hospital would have to look at its own capacity. Whether we have that capacity right now or not, I think it's open to debate. I think it's going to require your infrastructure in terms of your electronic health records. It's going to require cybersecurity, things that you didn't think about previously, you really need to think about. And you need to take along with you your leadership of the hospitals that you're working in to make sure that you're all aligned with this new approach. And maybe I'll just add one thing that's slightly off tangent. For many years, the argument has been we need to link between regulatory requirements and HTA assessments. I feel this move by the US FDA seems to have just thrown a spanner in the work if they're doing that. Because I cannot imagine that many HTA assessors will simply accept these kind of approach where you'll have one pivotal trial, that's more than enough. I feel like it's a step backwards, even though their argument is to try and accelerate access to treatment. I think many HTAs will take a very cautious approach before the medications are listed in their formularies.
Thank you for this answer. And I think also we can enforce the harmonization or call for harmonization between regulatory requirements as well as reimbursement requirements to augment and accelerate access to medications unless we do have, for example, a breakthrough drugs, or in certain cases where we need to have more evidence when it comes to the technology. And now I will move to policymakers and regulatory agencies, and I would like to ask Dr. Wajdan, given recent concern raised about the role of many stakeholders within pharmaceutical value chain and their impact on increasing drug prices, particularly through deals that may favor less optimal options in exchange for rebate gains, and more broadly, the reforms calling for greater transparency in decision-making, including negotiation and agreements with pharmaceutical industry. How can formulary system ensure transparency, consistency in access to decision-maker when there is so much pressure that may introduce influence or bias? And how do we draw the line between them? And do we need stronger policies in place to prevent this type of pressure?
I totally agree with you that the formulary process, or controlling and governing the formulary process, is crucial when we look at how accessibility can really pose bias and can pose a huge risk on the opinions of decision makers and leaders when we are in the evaluation process. I can name you so many times and so many evaluations where we kicked off the evaluation process and we received so many calls internally and externally asking us to expedite the review, expedite the result. We already know that we need this medication. You don't need to go meticulous in the evaluation. We already know that it is beneficial. I think the best way to answer these concerns is that the process needs to be reproducible, need to be strict and clear, and you need to be very transparent with everyone in terms of what are you requiring for your evaluation process. So you're not asking for something that wasn't asked before. You should be very transparent with stakeholders within your institution and very transparent with pharma companies. I think transparency might not be the best approach in the previous years, but I think now we are in the time to adopt this. Transparency will have less conflicts, less questionable decisions when you are reaching to the final stage. But definitely we are in the face of much pressure due to the lack of access in certain areas. The best way to approach this is to have a very transparent process, very transparent requirement, and to do it every time. Do not skip steps. You have to be very consistent in your evaluation.
Couldn't agree more. And if we move to our expert, international expert, Nil, turning to you. And you have been very active in analyzing the global market strategies and responses to most favored nation and tariff policies being advanced by the United States administration. And we have all followed your insightful report on how different European countries are reacting to these developments. In a market like Saudi Arabia, where there is relatively strong affordability for many innovative therapies, yet also a growing responsibility to ensure long-term healthcare sustainability for future generations. How do you foresee these global pricing and trades shift affecting drug access, launching sequence, and pharmaceutical pricing strategies in Saudi Arabia?
Well, we have a saying in the UK, it's an ill wind that blows nobody any good. The idea being that when you have challenges, there's a good chance that someone, although many will be disadvantaged, that there may be someone who will benefit from this process. And I think that is potentially the case with MFN, and I'd go so far as to say that countries such as Saudi Arabia could actually stand to be a beneficiary of this process. It's not clear-cut. I think if I didn't make that clear in my earlier presentation, one of the difficulties we face at present is just that there's so much uncertainty, there's lack of detail. I'm not sure that we'll ever have the full detail in terms of the content of MFN agreements, although the Trump administration is pressing Congress to codify these agreements to ensure that they survive beyond the term of the current president. I think, as I say, that potentially it could work to Saudi Arabia's benefit. And I say that because we are seeing, at least for the time being, a growing wariness on the part of the industry to think about launch plans in the MFN comparator markets, so in particular the major European markets, but also Japan and Canada. And Saudi Arabia also has factors in its favor that I touched on in my presentation, so relatively high spending and prices. I'm talking here from the industry's perspective, in terms of the attractiveness of the market, well-developed and growing infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, and of course, I think critically that desire to be an early launch market. So I think there is the potential for the country to move up the global launch sequence list when you take all of these factors together. I think it will also work to Saudi's advantage that we should be spared from the extreme pricing pressure that MFN comparator markets will face. there may be a need to rely less heavily on IRP from other countries. And I think, although there won't be that same pressure that we see in direct or indirect comparator countries, the industry will obviously still be concerned about the price level they can achieve in Saudi Arabia. I just had one final thought in answer to that question on the subject of transparency that has been mentioned. And I've been following this around the world for some years, and I know there's a growing momentum in favor of transparency around pricing, and I can see the logic of that. I think it may be necessary in the current climate possibly to take it back and think about where transparency is appropriate and where it may not be so advantageous. I think certainly what we're seeing in terms of countries that are comparator markets, they are looking very closely at how they can potentially ensure confidentiality of prices, given that the United States will be reference those, although it's still not entirely clear how great a defense that will be.
Thank you, Neil, and I agree with all of you, Dr. Wujdan and Neil, when it comes to transparency. Transparency is a bit relative terms that can be implemented either implicitly or explicitly over the entire, let's say, processes and methods and submission documents for, let's say, formulary management or institutions or regulatory bodies. And as you can see that there are lots of countries that evaluate medications using different methodology. However, when you look into the steps where they implement transparency, it is, or they can vary a lot among countries, among institutions. However, having some sort of transparency will add more legitimacy to the decision making and ensure that wherever the decision was issued by, regardless the institution, hospitals, or regulatory body, will be clear enough to establish, let's say, a mutual understanding why this medication was reimbursed or accessed or approved versus the other comparators. And if we want to ask you, Neil, about concrete actions that we need to consider today for Saudi Arabia specifically, to mitigate the risk of global pricing policies, such as MFN and tariff-driven strategy. What is your suggestions for the country?
Well, the first thing I'd say, and I think it's a really important point, is that there's a limit to what formulary leaders can do. I think the magnitude of MFN and other related policies is so great that ultimately it's politicians, policymakers, who will probably have to make the critical calls. We're certainly hearing that in one or two other countries. I think we've heard that in the UK. I alluded to developments in the UK in my presentation earlier this afternoon, and I think we've heard that from the former chief executive of NICE and the new incumbent in that role, that ultimately it's politicians who have to make decisions around issues such as the cost effectiveness threshold, and then HTA bodies will work within the parameters that they are given. I mean, in terms of continuing to ensure that multinational companies in particular want to launch their drugs early in Saudi Arabia, I think consideration does have to be given to the overall commercial environment to ensure that it is attractive to the industry. That's certainly what we're hearing in Europe to some extent. We were hearing that even before MFN, that there was a loss of attractiveness, and that was already being reflected, I think, in delayed launches or non-launches. I think to take a global perspective, and again, I just briefly touched on what's happening in China. I think that's certainly going to be important going forward. So to be open to the role that the Chinese companies and Chinese developed drugs might play in the pharmaceutical supply system. If we think about tariffs, I think really to date they have been focused primarily on driving development and production to the United States. So I'm not sure that they are such a major issue for the industry or the pharmaceutical sector in Saudi Arabia at present. But I would say that there is the possibility that a future Section 301 investigation could examine issues around intellectual property protection and access barriers. And as I said earlier, I think multinational companies have some reservations about aspects of intellectual property protection and access barriers in Saudi Arabia. So you shouldn't have to worry about the impact of MFN on pricing, but as I said, companies I think will still be concerned about the price level they can achieve. And I think perhaps one final thought would be to give further thought to the potential of managed entry agreements and innovative contracting approaches.
Well, thank you, Nell, for this answer, which you covered everything related to MFN and the Saudi challenges and expectations. And I could echo with you that Saudi Arabia, it could be a very potential target for multinational companies to launch first in the United States, and instead of going to European market, they will target Saudi market because of the, let's say, affordability and the budget available for resources, being a high-income country. And I'd like to move now to Dr. Abu Bakr, and being an ex-NIPCO and from a national procurement perspective, do we currently have a system in place to monitor early signals of drug prices increase? And have you observed any recent trends or patterns that are particularly concerned with MFN policies?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. It's a great discussion, صراحة, especially with the FNM. For the early signals, of course, Saudi Arabia has, through its central procurement mandate, NIPCO, and the large database that was being able to be built through the years, through the tenders, were able to successfully build a diverse basket of prices, whether it can be for medicines, medical supplies, medical devices, laboratory agents, and you name it. And so that enables the great visibility on the prices through tender prices and how these changes and international benchmarks. However, if you're asking for a real-time intelligence monitoring, we're still far from this. We're doing this as a retrospective basis rather than an actual dynamic for predicting any kind of changes. Several initiatives to monitor any possible changes in shortages, in supply, in actual manufacturing costs that would reflect on the prices of the agents or the molecules or the items that NIPCO usually places in tenders. But still, we're one step ahead. We're one step behind of this. And when it comes to most favored nations policies, I agree with the concept itself, and I don't think the problem with this concept itself. And I think the problem lies, in my personal opinion, in the downstream effect that it might produce. And so, because let's face it, if this U.S. market as a major market in the pharmaceutical industry anchors its prices at the lowest global price, that would produce one of three possibilities. Either, and I have in the audience a lot of our colleagues from the manufacturing industry and pharma industry. So I think the fireback would come as either withdrawing from the market, as Dr. Neil said, lost favor of the market, or delayed entry to the market as well, and that would reflect on the access to these pharmaceuticals to the patients. Or third, even renegotiating current existing contracts. And so I think the downstream effect is something that needs to be considered very carefully across all stakeholders involved in such policies in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Bakr. And we will continue with another questions related to my favorite and mesmerizing word to my ears, which is managed entry agreement. I heard this term 3-4 times till now. And by the way, we have recently accepted and published managed entry agreement papers. You should expect to see it soon. This was developed in collaboration with the Saudi Formulary Management Society. But going back and referring to managed entry agreement, could you enlighten us about any updates related to NIPCO's experience with value-based or let's say outcome-based agreements or managed entry agreements in general?
Absolutely. So I believe managed entry agreements is at an early but promising stage in Saudi Arabia. We've got similar, we've got some couple of successful models with MOH. I might leave it to Dr. Wujdan as well, or anyone would like to tip in. But for NIPCO, we're in the process in developing multiple managed entry agreements to ensure the access and the better value. And it's basically the language we use with pharmaceutical industry is that we're not going to pay you for your products based on prices set elsewhere by geopolitical dynamics or so. We're paying you for whatever value we see in our population. And this is a different perspective. So it turns the negotiation away from pricing entirely to something to be added on. And I think the managed entry agreements as well ensures that we have a better stock for vital and key items for whatever we have placed in tenders.
And what could be the potential engagement of formulary managers from different institutions with NIPCOs at the moment?
Okay. So the major engagement between NIPCO and formulary managers or leaders in healthcare institutions is usually through the healthcare institutions liaisons. And I've seen some committees where the liaisons come from all different healthcare institutions to tip in the discussion and the negotiation with the pharmaceutical industry in the preparatory phases. But still, the actual concept of MEAs is still at early stage, as I said. And I think better refinement and more to become, especially for chronic diseases, because the focus was initially on the managed entry agreements on the high cost rare disease medications, but now we see a lot cooking for the chronic diseases as well, to reflect the value on the patients as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Abu Bakr, for this insight, and I would like to move to Dr. Nada now. And from health insurance perspective, whether we are talking about public insurance or private insurance, and in the context of Saudi Arabia's healthcare system transformation and increasing move toward privatization and insurance excellence. As we know that in the United States, we have seen the emergence of vertical integration models between insurers, pharmacy benefit managers, and wholesalers. While these models aim to improve coordination, they are also often associated with concern about drug pricing transparency and rising cost. And my question, Dr. Nada, do you see any signals or, let's say, tendencies for similar models to emerge within our healthcare systems? And if yes, how confident that they will evolve the system and avoid similar challenges and dynamics?
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. Very interesting discussion and a very interesting question. At the beginning, we need to differentiate a little bit between the two ecosystems, Saudi Arabia versus the US. In Saudi Arabia, we have some safeguards, let's say, or different regulatory positions that are not available in the US, such as regulating pricing, looking into pricing, benchmarking, and others, which is a little bit not the situation with third parties at the US. So that is one of the safeguards. Are we seeing vertical integration now? Yes, the bylaw is now allowing vertical integration, and we are seeing this a lot coming and emerging in terms of primary care, secondary care between insurance and the provider. But we're fortunate in Saudi Arabia that this change is coming with the system. So we are having a huge transparency on how it's going. We're building the ecosystem to accommodate all of those changing environments. So it's a transparency integration rather than an integration with disruption. And this is a benefit for Saudi Arabia in comparison to the other systems.
Thank you, Dr. Nada. And since you mentioned safeguarding, is there any current policies available within the country to prevent potential unintended consequences of such an integration?
There is some actually as a regulator perspective, but what we need to invest more now is the interinstitutional linkage. So how to operationalize those safeguards between the entire ecosystem rather than building them in silo. And this is where the actual investment that in Saudi Arabia we need to build on to mature our systems.
Thank you. And now moving to industry with Dr. Saleh. So considering all the previous discussion, and if major markets shift toward reference pricing models, and as you know that in Saudi Arabia we depend basically on external reference pricing as one of the requirements or what's one of the regulations for pricing medications in Saudi Arabia. Do you anticipate manufacturers delaying launches in countries such as Saudi Arabia or perhaps GCC countries to protect global price corridors, and how should national formularies prepare for this possibility?
Thank you, Prof. So, as we know, one of the modalities for any market is to use the reference pricing basically to decide on which prices to do. One of which is Saudi basically. And also from pharma companies' perspective, they are putting considerations for MFN implications basically, and also to manage the broader pricing implications for any drug basically. This might be presenting as a challenge for certain markets and cause some delays. However, in putting this into context of Saudi, we have I think part of the transformation and then the vision, the clear vision when it comes to healthcare, and then some of the activities that have been implemented, especially from Saudi FDA perspective, where you can do a parallel submission basically to US. Saudi is being primed as a potential market for early launch. So I'm basically agreeing with you, Prof, and also with Neil as well on this point. And then I think and this would support definitely the patient in Saudi, right? So we were adopting innovation early on. So this is one aspect. The other aspect, I think, from formulary management perspective is not easy to say, right? But the balance between sustainability and also maintaining attractiveness of the market, basically, because this is one of the aspects where we can basically demonstrate to global decision makers where launch can be made early on in Saudi, basically. So this is one aspect. And then another basically modalities where we can decouple the list price from the net price, basically. So it can be from institution perspective discussions, the discussion on net prices, but we can be more flexible from list prices, basically. So the drug can be adopted early on. And also the adoption of innovative access agreements, management agreements as well. And I think also there is an important element, which is the partnership. So between the manufacturers and policymakers and also institutions, decision makers, in order for us as collectively to position Saudi Arabia as early launch markets, basically, and have the drugs available for our patients. So this is from my perspective. Yeah.
And my other question to you, Dr. Saleh, how multinational pharma companies in Saudi Arabia coped with these changes in terms of strategic, let's say, operational aspects related to their, for example, internal capabilities and early discussions and launching strategies compared with the situation before the introduction or emerging of such policy?
We're getting busy. they're getting busy as well, right? So, I mean, this is like a new concept from a global standpoint. We're not sure like how the market would react to it, starting from Saudi FTA, and then when we go and discuss basically with the private or the government sector, right? But like the mindset that Saudi is an attractive market, and then we're thinking of solutions basically to still have our drugs basically launched in markets, but also, and we do this with getting insights. So most of the panelists perhaps I have discussed with, or most of the people here, like, because I think this is the way, like that we collaborate, we understand, and then we find ways. For example, to have this, like the drugs early launched in Saudi, right? So.
Great. Going back to Dr. Wajdan. Do you foresee formulary committees globally taking on a greater role in value arbitration if national pricing policies become increasingly detached from a clinical benefit? And what governance structure should be in place to support these transitions in Saudi Arabia?
To be quite honest, I think national pricing is detached from clinical value of medications already. We're not facing that risk. We're at that stage currently. And that's why I think formulary managers and formulary leaders should really take into consideration discussions about the price of the medication and how can we mitigate the risk economically, and how can we address it and incorporate those discussions internally. We are no longer individual sectors working on our own. We need to harmonize our work. We need to connect with regulators, connect with the entire ecosystem to ensure that the pricing doesn't take a very long time to be set, first of all. It takes way longer than it should. And it should be discussed within formularies, within formulary leaders, how can we proceed with such medications while looking at the national prices of the current medications. I do believe that discussion should happen at the formulary level. We should be discussing prices. How can we move forward with our discussions, connecting with regulators, harmonizing our discussions, and having a clear perspective on each medication in regard to its current prices, and how can it be incorporated into formularies, and how can we provide access to patients. With the current prices of medications that are nationally available now, I don't think access can be guaranteed for a larger group of patients. It's very limiting, and I don't think that is the price we should be paying for those medications.
Thank you for this answer, and I totally agree with you. And if we want to go back to Dr. Abu Bakr, so please be patient with me. Okay, go ahead, please.
I would just like to comment, and I totally agree with Dr. Wajdan that pricing that happens at the Saudi FDA, for example, affect all stakeholders. And if not all the stakeholders are involved in such a decision, that would definitely reflect on this, of these items and medications to the patients.
Thank you. And could policies aims to protecting and promoting local manufacturing have unintended short-term effect on drug prices or access, Dr. Abu Bakr?
Definitely. If the short answer is definitely. I'm quite sure that the majority here knows that there are any higher authority committees to come up with the incentive list items and localization items to make sure that these items are localized, and the reason for these items to enter the localization process is just because of the huge demand that needed in the Saudi market. For pricing wise, I think going back to the managed entry agreements, especially for the biologics and biosimilars, that would tip in or factored in terms of pricing as well. Yes.
Good. And Dr. Muhammad, if we want to go back to you and ask you about, from your experience and many years experience in formulary management. How should national committees prepare for potential disruptions in API supply chains that may arise from geopolitical or trade policy changes affecting global manufacturing hubs?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Leila covered most of it in her presentation. So it's many of the things that was mentioned during that presentation, being identifying those medications that are at risk, identifying or diversifying the suppliers that you've got. And I would also say, I think we learned a lot from COVID. I think COVID had a fundamental effect on healthcare systems around the world, not least in Saudi Arabia. And the lessons that were learned during COVID, I think, will stand us in good stead. I understand it's a totally different situation, but I'm sure the challenges are familiar to us. They're not coming out of the blue, as we saw during the COVID era. At a local level, or at a hospital or institutional level, I think it's going to be absolutely vital that you have a seamless communication and linking between formulary managers, supply chain, logistics, to get ahead of the curve in terms of what's happening. But like I said, I think the lessons that were learned from COVID have stood us in good stead.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for your insightful answer. And going back to Nil, in Saudi Arabia, where pricing regulations depend heavily on external reference pricing, as you know that, alongside having a fragmented formulary decision, since we have multiple institutions with multiple responsibilities with either corporate BNTs or individual BNTs. How do you see the balance evolving between global price benchmarking and locally derived efforts toward patient-centric value framework when making formulary decision? Mute, you are on mute.
I'm sorry, I had some difficulty hearing that question.
You want me to repeat the question? Okay.
Yes, please.
In Saudi Arabia, where pricing regulations depend basically on external reference pricing, alongside having a fragmented formulary decisions, having different institutions, different accounts. Sometimes we do have corporate BNTs and sometimes we have institutional BNTs. How do you see the balance evolving between global benchmarking, price benchmarking, and locally derived efforts toward patient-centric value framework when making formulary decisions?
Thank you. My apologies. I didn't catch the question the first time. So I think it really is really interesting, and I think comment was made earlier today that really there's something of an irony in the premise of MFN. There's long been criticism, and it's contained in MFN, of the approaches to pricing that are used in other countries, in particular those that have been selected as comparators. And yet, in essence, it will be importing those. And I think that being said, that MFN is likely to the change rather than the abolition of national patient-centered value frameworks. So I think they will still be there, but they may need to adapt to this new climate. And I think it may be particularly useful for Saudi Arabia to keep a close eye on what is happening in the UK, and I know it's probably a market that you already follow with some interest, but I think not least because it is one of these comparator markets, but also at the stage in having negotiated that agreement. And as part of that, they've already agreed the sort of framework, the terms of reference for renegotiation of the agreement that defines the pricing environment in the UK, which is known as the Voluntary Access Agreement, VPAG. And it's already specified that they're going to look at novel solutions that work for both industry and government, including outcomes-based payments. And I know there's been some talk this afternoon about the role that outcomes-based agreements play and the challenges that they they present both at a national and an institutional level. But there's also, I think they're going to explore the potential of varying quality thresholds for different medicines. So I think there is still that potential to have national patient-centered value frameworks, but they'll probably need to adapt to this new climate, I would say.
And my other question to you, Nell, and we have seen lots of scientific publication related to generic manufacturing that may be disproportionately affected by tariff-related cost pressures. In a system like Saudi Arabia, which relies heavily on generics as a cost containment policy, what downstream impact could this have on formulary breadth and therapeutic substitution strategies?
Yeah, so we see a number of countries that are heavily reliant on generics and biosimilars. In some ways, it may be easier for them to adapt. I think of comments that were made long before MFN was announced by President Macron in France, really suggesting that France had perhaps got its approach to drug pricing wrong and should take a more German approach with more focus on cost containment at the mature end of the product life cycle rather than at launch. And I think they've taken some very modest steps in that direction. So I think there are probably a lot of healthcare systems that can do better at recognizing the potential savings from generics and biosimilars, and that can perhaps be leveraged to provide additional funding to support innovative medicines. I would also say I think there's a case to be made at this point, taking a step back and looking at healthcare systems as a whole. So looking beyond just pharmaceutical supply, at where there may be inefficiencies and where savings could be realized. And we see that happening in Germany at present, for example. They're undertaking a major review of spending in their healthcare system, looking at where there is inefficiency. Pharmaceutical sector will not be immune from that, but they're looking much more broadly at that. And I think also at what role pharmaceuticals can actually play in enhancing efficiency potentially in other areas of the care system and delivering downstream savings. And of course, if you're going to do that, then you have to find ways to really to recognize those. And I think that's often a challenge in healthcare systems where you have very much a sort of silo mentality that makes it difficult to recognize savings in other budgets.
Okay. And since we do have lots of multinational companies sitting with us here today, can we understand that it can impact, or it can, for example, promote for the headroom for innovation concept for multinational companies, stop investing on off-patent medications and moving toward a new innovative in-patent medications, and leave off-patent medication for let's say local companies so that they can produce it or manufacture it as a part of generic products?
So I think it's interesting. I mean, in perhaps some of the more established pharmaceutical markets, we see that they've probably already made that transition. That may be less established in some less mature markets, where I think they can still realize a significant share of revenue from off-patent drugs, in part because the sort of sales curve tends to be quite different in the more mature pharmaceutical markets from what some would still term to be emerging markets. But I think there's certainly a case to be made for incentivizing multinationals to give greater focus to the development of innovative medicines. And I think in some countries and indeed in We're seeing initiatives to try to incentivize the development of drugs that really address what is perceived to be an unmet clinical need.
Well, thank you, Neil. And now moving to Dr. Amal. Do you foresee trade-driven cost escalation leading to more restrictive formularies globally? And should Saudi Arabia institutions being integrating geopolitical risk consideration into horizon scanning and health technology assessment processes?
Well, I'm sorry to say I couldn't hear you properly because
Okay.
the echo is
Do
distracting
you
them.
foresee trade-driven cost escalation leading to more restrictive formulary? So we are talking basically about, let's say, limiting the population or having, let's say, a specific group of population globally. And should Saudi Arabian institutions being integrating geopolitical risk consideration into horizon scanning and health technology assessment processes? Or we should just, let's say, keep
as
our
we are.
value framework as is, and we stick to, let's say, clinical evaluation as well as the economic evaluation?
Definitely no. We have, we have to align with the other systems internationally, definitely we need to consider all these, changes globally in order not to be left behind. We need to tailor our ecosystem to our population, sure, but also we have to consider the outside or the global circumstances as well. We have to adapt, all the strategies that can meet our population, our systems. And as we said before, staying, only the solo country or the solo system, just depending on multi-clinical trials, if they will move forward with the one pivotal clinical trials, this is not a wise, I think. And depending on the real-world evidence, I think this is the new era to move towards the stewardshiping rather than gatekeeping. I think this is the wise pathway.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I'm aware of the time, unless you are enjoying the discussion, of course. My question for Dr. Wujdan, then Dr. Nadab. How might Saudi Arabia leverage managed entry agreements or outcome-based contracts as a mitigation strategies against future global pricing instability driven by policy of tariff change?
I do believe that implementing outcome-based agreement has an inherited risk of increase of prices where you have to deal with that as well. But during our contracting, at least in Ministry of Health, we have taken into consideration to explicitly formalize the price of the medication in the agreement. So it is stable as long as the outcome-based agreement is active. But definitely, by approaching the end of any managed entry agreement, specifically outcome-based agreement, if that outcome has been already established, I don't think it's wise to still look into outcomes while renewing these type of contracts. Hence, a financial agreement should replace that outcome-based agreement, and consideration of pricing while the price is increasing should be also considered. But definitely, an outcome-based agreement should have an element of the price included in that.
This is well said, and this is from a public point of view. Now we'll go to the private point of view. Dr. Nada?
Okay, from private point of view, we observe the challenges. Now, we have lots of modalities coming, registered by the Saudi FDA, and it comes to not is it cost effective, it's can we afford it? And if we understand that question properly, we need to build our managed entry agreement on that basis. It's not the lowest price, it's how could we build that managed entry agreement to consider both both volume, outcome, and certain other aspects to balance it. So what is done now in CHI, we're working on a framework to encounter different scenarios that could be applicable in the market in order to adapt with the current system. Because we truly believe that without market entry agreement and value-based agreement, that sustainability of care would be a question. And this is part of the adaptability. This is part of the growth of the formulary management.
Thank you, Dr. Nada.
And just to add, maybe in the private sector, it's a little bit complex because you're speaking about provider, you're speaking about insurance, different payer, separated payer, and pharma. So how
policy type as well.
And policy as well. So how to link that? We have some enablers, which is technology, SHIP and Nafis Clinical, that will help mature those managed entry agreement. But of course, governance is a must.
Thank you. And my next question will be to Dr. Mohammed and Nil. In your view, will emerging global pricing policies such as MFN pricing or international reference pricing reforms necessitate a shift from traditional cost-effectiveness-based HTA toward affordability-focused budget governance at the institutional level?
So I think we haven't fully seen, in Saudi Arabia at least, what the full impact of the decisions by the Trump administration has been. And I think, as was pointed out earlier on, I think our role as formulary managers, when it's coming at this sort of much higher level, is going to be relatively limited from that perspective. So if you saw the example that Dr. Leila gave in her talk about the situation in France, where the American president demanded that France increases its cost in order to meet the requirements for the pricing. So it's kind of at that level. Now that's going to mean that we need some adaptability at a local level, but it also means I think we need to find a way for us to be able to harmonize amongst ourselves. I think the biggest problem that we have is our fragmentation right now. Like each one of us or each institution has its own P&T committee, which makes totally different independent decisions from the other, which makes it very difficult to have a kind of unified approach to these challenges, shall we say. And if I could just maybe take one step back about value-based agreements and outcome-based agreements, I think it's really, it's something that's become really important over the last couple of years, and how you leverage these kind of agreements in order to mitigate the risks of the pricing associated with these expensive medications versus the uncertainty. I think it's also important to point out, and I keep saying this, I think it's really important to point out whether or not you have the capacity to do this. Number two, the resources that you're going to utilize in order to execute these kind of agreements, do they really match up to the savings or the savings that you will achieve as a result of the rebates or the reimbursements that you're going to get as a result of these kind of outcome-based agreements? And often that information is missing. How much of the resources that you're going to implement or you're going to use to implement these agreements balance against any rebates that you're going to get back as a result of these agreements. And I feel often when we're discussing these topics, that information is not always available. And if you were to ask other centers, have you actually sat down and worked how much it costs for you to be able to execute these agreements? More often than not, the answer would be no. It's just something that we want to be able to do and mitigate the risks.
Couldn't agree more. And the same question for you, Neil.
Yeah, so I'll pick on the points that were just made. I'd entirely agree that managed entry and innovative contracting needs to be used selectively because of in particular, the sort of more outcomes-based approaches, because of the administrative burden and cost that they involve. I think there's still a place for their use if they are applied selectively. I think back to a conversation I had a few years back with the head of the commercial medicines unit at NHS England, and was very open to exploring new approaches to innovative contracting with companies, encouraged companies to come forward and offer suggestions. At the same time said he didn't want to have a building full of people crunching numbers, so recognizing additional administrative burden that incurs at all stages, so on clinicians, but also on administrative staff in terms of processing the data that are generated, if you can generate the data consistently and reliably. And that's another whole issue in terms of the data infrastructure that is required. I think where you do have a high level of fragmentation, and that has come through as something of a theme, I guess this afternoon, discussion in terms of the Saudi system, that is a challenge both for the healthcare system, but I think also for pharmaceutical companies. I mean, in many ways, I think they would probably prefer to be able to conduct a negotiation and agree terms at a national level. But probably in every healthcare system, that it can prove difficult to implement that at the local level, I would say. If we go back to sort of comments that were made about by President Trump, I mean, picking up on what he said to President Macron, I've actually watched speeches on at least 4 occasions where he's alluded to that and said that he had conversations with him and other European leaders that said that they would have to double, treble, or quadruple their prices. They flatly refused to do that. And then when he threatened tariffs, wines and champagne, as Leila said earlier, he said that they capitulated. I've seen no independent corroboration of that. We have had a statement on at least 2 occasions from the office of the French president saying that's not how it works. But what we do know has happened is this US-UK pricing agreement. And again, I think it's certainly worth watching how that is implemented. That's being offered as a model, and I think the terms of that are much more modest in terms of the degree of upheaval than what President Trump has said about pressuring companies to double, treble, or quadruple their prices. So I think it's worth looking at. When I say it as a model, terms would obviously differ from one country to another, but the broader approach, I think, is interesting in these challenging times.
Thank you, Neil. And my last question in this session, directed to Dr. Abu Bakr and Dr. Saleh as well. Looking ahead, what structural changes should national formulary system like those implemented in Saudi Arabia today to remain resilient against trade-related cost shocks in pharmaceutical supply chain?
No, say the question again, please.
Is it that difficult?
I think, yeah.
Okay.
It's more academic.
So if we look ahead, moving within this transformation and the current scenarios or the current, let's say, formulary management systems, should it stay as is, or it should be more agile and resilient to respond against trade-related cost shocks in terms of supply chain?
I think, as I mentioned before, through partnership and collaboration, basically, we should think of innovative solutions in order to overcome such challenges. Basically, so this is what we had in mind. For example, when the MFN aspect basically came into the picture, we recognize it affects what is being referenced from pricing perspective, such as the list prices, right? So there is another way for us to price drugs, which is the net prices, but where we can assure confidentiality as well, right? So this is something. This could present as a challenge in private sector, as mentioned by Doctora, that we have multiple entities. So we have the insurance company, we have the provider, and also we have the pharma company, and it's not as easy to do a deal compared to institution and pharma company. I think the collaboration and the innovation to overcome such challenges basically would be the way to go.
I totally agree, and I would like to add that from procurement or central procurement perspective, I think something that's already on place, the volume aggregation when ordering or placing tenders to make sure that items are supplied in abundance, to make sure that there is a availability of these items, and strategic stockholding. And so I think the majority knows that there is this life-saving item that needs to meet a criteria to be available in 24 locations, and the availability must be 100% for 3 months at least. And so this kind of strategic solutions and plans that I think absorbs any shocks in supply chain. Yes, it's temporary, but it would have a mega effect since we're operating on a central procurement model in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Dr. Bakr. I don't know if we do have the time for a quick question or two. 1 or 2 questions. عشان ما يقولوا ما نعطيهم فرصة.
Thank you, all of you. A great panel discussion, very insightful. And my question is to Dr. Abbas. So you talked about one of the factors that might help in transparency is ensuring that the process is reproducible. So I can give you an example of a drug we've discussed 4 times and rejected 4 times. So it's by evidence not reproducible.
There is a way. I think that's the approach with them.
Yeah.
There is a will, there is a way. That's why it's being requested.
So I think the purpose is always of our meetings is kind of come up with some idea to improve practice. So what would your recommendation be in some situations like this where it's truly rediscussed because there is some type of pressure coming from different places ongoing, and then how can you build a system that prevents that from happening? And like you have one appeal and that's it.
Yeah. So we have faced similar situations where a request will come up several times during the year for a certain medication or a certain request to the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. What we've done so far to eliminate any repetitions and to eliminate any changes in the process, any medication that is discussed in the PTC with a clear decision on it, we will look at the decision voting. If it's a unanimous decision, then we will do a response to that requester indicating exactly what was the basis of the decision without disclosing much in details of the decision. If there is no unanimous decision on this request, but it favors against that request, we will look at whether there is any published data after the date of that discussion, so we can inform the committee of new emerging evidence. If there is no new emerging evidence, then we will respond the same way, indicating exactly why this request was answered the way it was.
Unless the price is a bit further reduced.
I would also add, whenever there is something that is rejected, there is a reason for rejection, either unavailability of sufficient clinical evidence, either affordability issue. And part of the decision that this is what we do in CHI, sharing the reasoning. So we leave the research aspect or supplying the further information with the requester. Either they are a clinician, either they are a hospital or a pharma. So now, and we publish actually our reviews. Every review is published, all the references is there. So if you have something to debate, and clinical decisions are usually changed, evidence is growing, evidence clinically or evidence financially even. So that would help even in re-evaluating a request and adjusting the response.
Thank you. Dr. Aman?
Also, I like to add, in order not just to waste our time and efforts, we give time a frame if there is no any emerging evidence or no affordability, information or nothing, they are not allowed to request again for the medication to be added to the formulary unless they bring something new, because we've been facing this. The product is rejected, and the company might receive a shock that the product is rejected, and they may reintroduce the product among another provider. And that's why we have to put certain restriction in order not to receive it again unless there is a valid reason for this.
Well, I think by this we conclude. And on behalf of our audience, I would like to thank our panelists for their insightful and, insightful input about this topic for today. And thank you, everyone. And I wish that you have learned a lot about the impact of MFN on Saudi Arabia and the future act in terms of preparation and what we need to expect in the near future. Thank you, and hopefully